Hello, students, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on the Civil Rights Movement, which is chapter 18 in your textbooks. We're going to start off this second part with the most important and famous figure in the modern Civil Rights Movement, and that's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You see a picture of him here on the screen, a very profitable instrument in the modern Civil Rights Movement. He was a Baptist minister that advocated nonviolent protests to end segregation. He wanted African Americans and whites to protest nonviolently to win the right for African Americans to take a level playing field, take an equal place in our society. Now, what propelled him to fame was the Montgomery bus boycott touched off by Rosa Parks. That is what made him a household name, so to speak. We also have the SCLC, a very important group that was operating during this time, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was founded by Dr. King, and their main goal was to fight for civil rights in the South. Now, the movement started to gain ground once some of these events became televised and known throughout the country. A favorite tactic of civil rights activists was a sit-in. It's where African Americans and whites would go to a white-only area of a restaurant, of a soda fountain, of a drugstore, and they would sit in the white-only area and they would refuse to move. This is an example of a peaceful protest. The first sit-in took place in Greensboro, North Carolina, and from there they also had wade-ins where African Americans would go to the white-only part of the beach and wade in the beach, and read-ins where they would go to the white-only part of a library and sit and read. Again, these are examples of nonviolent protests to end segregation. A group that is like the SCLC was the SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was a grassroots movement, which means it started with the people and spread around the country. And they fought for civil rights, again, using the nonviolent methods. The Freedom Ride took place in the spring of 1961. At that time, the bus routes and the segregation codes within the states forbid whites and blacks to ride together in certain parts. And to protest this, blacks and whites rode in a bus from Washington, D.C. all the way to Mississippi, breaking the local segregation codes of the localities they drove through. Now, President Kennedy was informed of this ahead of time and reassured the Mississippi police that it was their duty to protect the riders as they traveled. This brings us to the Birmingham protest, another important civil rights moment that took place in the spring of 1963. If you will, please stop the video and look at page 593 in your textbook. Martin Luther King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference led a civil rights march in Birmingham, Alabama. They chose Birmingham because this was the most segregated city in the South. During the protest, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested by the local sheriff, which was Police Chief Bull Connor. In this arrest and during this protest, he used attack dogs on the protesters. He let off fire hoses on the protesters and was very violent toward the protesters. And because of this, when this was broadcast across America on television screens, this made people have more sympathy for the civil rights movement, and they began to call for action. People were outraged when they saw what was actually happening to these peaceful protesters. And in the end, this helped to actually win support for the civil rights movement. Another very famous event is the March on Washington, which occurred during 1963. Again, please pause the video and look at page 594. MLK led over 200,000 peaceful protesters on a march through Washington, D.C. The day's events culminated with speeches given from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And during this march, Martin Luther King made his very famous I Have a Dream speech. This was during the March on Washington in 1963. Now, the purpose of this whole event was to put pressure on Congress to pass civil rights laws. And pass them they did. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 64, banning public segregation, outlawing segregation on a federal level across the United States in public areas. And it said that the federal government can enforce desegregation in schools. Now, there were many new successes that came after that, but also new challenges. A couple of successes are first the Voting Rights Act of 65, which said that you could not have a literacy test, which is a test to see whether you can read or write before you vote. It said you could not have a literacy test as a qualifying test to be able to vote in any of the 50 states. The 24th Amendment banned the poll tax. A poll tax, of course, is a tax that is required to be paid before you vote. We cannot charge a poll tax in this country. Now, sort of the antithesis or maybe counterpart to MLK was Malcolm X. Malcolm X was actually born Malcolm Little, but used an X to represent his lost African name. During this time, many African Americans protested the fact that their last names had came from the slaves of the slave owners of their ancestors. And so Malcolm Little felt that his name was a quote-unquote slave name and used X. He joined the Nation of Islam, which is founded by Elijah Muhammad, and part of their beliefs were that you do not use drugs or alcohol, and they wanted to separate the races completely. In February of 1965, Malcolm X was tragically shot after returning from Mecca. And I said that he was the opposite of MLK because he advocated militant protests. Malcolm X wanted to use violence and militant protests in order to gain African American civil rights. Thank you for watching part 2.